The probate courtroom in Madison smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The kind of quiet, formal place where family secrets were usually revealed in calm voices and legal language. But that morning, nothing about the Carter estate hearing felt calm. Before the judge had even finished organizing the documents in front of him, my Uncle Daniel stood up. He straightened his navy suit, adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist, and slowly scanned the room like a man who had already decided how the story would end. "My father built a fortune," he said loudly, his voice echoing against the wooden walls of the courtroom. "And I'm taking half of it." That's what he would have wanted. A ripple of gasps spread across the room. Someone behind me whispered something under their breath. One of the older relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Even the judge raised his eyebrows slightly. Daniel didn't seem to notice any of it. His eyes were locked on me. He smiled in a slow, confident way that made it clear he believed the outcome of this hearing had already been decided. But sitting quietly in my lap was a thick folder. Inside that folder was a copy of my grandfather's will. And the moment my uncle decided to claim half of the Carter estate in that courtroom, he had unknowingly triggered a clause that would destroy his entire claim. Within minutes, the judge would be laughing. But Daniel Carter didn't know that yet. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old. And until recently, I was just the granddaughter who lived in the quiet house near Lake Mendota with my grandfather during the final year of his life. But on that morning in probate court, I had become something else entirely. The hearing itself had drawn more people than I expected. The Carter family had been part of our small Wisconsin town for decades. And my grandfather, Thomas Carter, had built a reputation that extended far beyond our family. He started Carter Freight Logistics with a single used truck and a rented warehouse near the rail yard 40 years ago. Over time, that one truck became a regional shipping company with contracts across 3 states and dozens of drivers who treated my grandfather like family. Some of those drivers were sitting quietly in the back row of the courtroom now. So were relatives I hadn't seen in years. People who suddenly seemed very interested in the Carter estate. I sat beside my grandfather's longtime attorney, Margaret Lowell. Margaret had known my grandfather for more than 20 years. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she reviewed the documents in front of her with the calm focus of someone who had seen many family disputes before. As the room settled, she leaned slightly toward me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear her. "Your grandfather expected this." I turned to her, confused. Expected what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued reviewing the will in front of her, turning one page carefully, but something in her tone made my stomach tighten. Across the room, Daniel was speaking confidently with his lawyer. He looked exactly the same as he always had at family gatherings. Perfectly pressed suit, expensive cufflinks, the relaxed posture of someone used to being the center of attention. Growing up, everyone had always assumed Daniel would one day run Carter Freight. He was my grandfather's oldest son, the one who worked at the company for years, the one relatives described as the natural successor. Daniel believed it too, even now. He spoke loudly enough that several relatives in the courtroom could hear him. "This shouldn't take long," he said to his lawyer with a small chuckle. "Dad would never leave me out of his fortune." A few people nodded awkwardly. Others avoided looking in my direction, because everyone in that room knew something they weren't saying out loud. For the last year of my grandfather's life, I had been the one living in his house. I was the one who drove him to doctor appointments, the one who helped him sort through paperwork, the one who sat with him late at night in his study reviewing company files while the lake outside the window turned dark. One of my cousins sitting 2 rows behind me whispered quietly to someone beside her. I thought Emily was the one taking care of Grandpa. Her voice carried just far enough for me to hear it. Daniel either didn't notice or didn't care. The judge finally entered the courtroom, and everyone stood. When we sat again, the judge explained the purpose of the hearing. The court would review the final will of Thomas Carter and confirm the distribution of his estate. Normally these proceedings were simple, but before the judge had even finished speaking, Daniel's lawyer stood up. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, My client believes the current distribution of the Carter estate deserves further review. The words sent a quiet murmur through the room. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, watching the reaction. He looked pleased. He stood again, this time addressing the judge directly. My father built that company for his family, he said confidently, and I intend to claim my rightful half. The room went completely silent. Then Daniel turned his head toward me, and he smiled. But as he sat down again, I slowly opened the folder resting in my lap. Inside was the final will my grandfather had signed months before he died. The same document Daniel clearly had never read carefully. Because if he had, he would have known that by demanding half the Carter fortune in that courtroom. He had just activated the one clause my grandfather wrote specifically for him. In our small Wisconsin town, the Carter name had always carried a certain weight. Not the kind that came from politics or old family wealth, but the kind built slowly through decades of hard work and reputation. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, started Carter Freight Logistics with a single used truck and a warehouse that barely stayed warm through the winter. The story was told so often in town that even people who had never met him could repeat it. He drove that truck himself for years. He negotiated contracts at diners along the highway. He fixed broken engines with his own hands when drivers called in the middle of the night. By the time I was born, Carter Freight had grown into a regional shipping company with routes across 3 states and a fleet of trucks that lined the back lot of the warehouse like a quiet army. But inside our family, the story everyone believed was much simpler. One day, Daniel Carter would inherit it all. Daniel was my grandfather's oldest son. At family gatherings, he sat beside Grandpa during dinner, listening to conversations about fuel prices, delivery schedules, and new contracts. While the rest of us talked about school or sports, Daniel talked about expansion and profit margins. Relatives used to say it almost like a fact of nature. Daniel will run Carter Freight someday. Even when I was a kid, I remember hearing it. And Daniel believed it too. When he joined the company in his 30s, the assumption became even stronger. My grandfather gave him a management position and began including him in financial decisions. At first, everything looked promising. Daniel was confident and ambitious. He talked about expanding routes and modernizing the fleet. Some employees liked his energy, but over time, small problems began appearing. Contracts that didn't quite make sense. Drivers complaining about unrealistic schedules. Suppliers calling the office asking why payments were suddenly late. None of it was dramatic enough to cause a crisis. But the pattern was there. I remember the first moment I realized something might be wrong. I had stopped by the warehouse one afternoon during college to drop off paperwork for my grandfather. As I walked past the loading dock, I overheard 2 of the older drivers talking quietly. One of them had worked for my grandfather since the early years. He shook his head slowly and said, "Mister, Carter built this place the hard way." The other driver asked what he meant. The first one glanced toward the office where Daniel was working. Just hope Daniel doesn't run it into the ground. At the time, I thought it was just frustration. Businesses always had disagreements. But not long after that conversation, my grandfather began quietly reclaiming some of the decisions Daniel had made. New contracts were reviewed more carefully. Certain financial approvals suddenly required my grandfather's signature again. It wasn't an argument. My grandfather never confronted Daniel publicly. He simply started taking control back. Over the next few years, something else changed too. Daniel started appearing less often. At first it was business trips, then new investment opportunities in Chicago. Eventually, whole months passed when Daniel didn't visit the warehouse at all. When he did come to family holidays, he talked more about real estate deals and stock markets than about Carter Freight. One Thanksgiving evening stands out clearly in my memory. Our family was gathered around the long dining table in my grandfather's house. The windows were fogged from the cold outside, and the kitchen smelled like roasted turkey and sweet potatoes. Daniel was describing one of his latest investments in Chicago. "Quick turnaround," he said proudly. "Bought the property in March. Sold it by August." My grandfather listened quietly for a moment. Then he set down his fork. "Building something takes patience," he said calmly. "Not shortcuts." Daniel laughed like it was a harmless comment. But my grandfather didn't laugh. He simply continued eating. As the years passed, Daniel visited less and less. Sometimes he skipped holidays entirely. Other times he arrived late, stayed an hour, and left before dessert. Meanwhile, my grandfather's health began to slow him down. Nothing dramatic, just the gradual changes that come with age. Driving long distances became difficult. He stopped visiting the warehouse every day. Some mornings he preferred to sit in his study overlooking Lake Mendota and handle business calls from there. That was when my role in his life began to change. At first it was small things. Driving him to doctor appointments, picking up groceries, helping him sort through the stack of mail that arrived every week. But slowly those responsibilities grew into something more. One afternoon he asked if I could help him organize a folder of company documents, invoices, driver schedules, contract renewals. We spent nearly 3 hours at his desk that day, reviewing paperwork together. At one point he handed me a thick file of shipping contracts. "Daniel used to go through these with me," he said quietly. The way he said it didn't sound angry. It sounded disappointed. From that point on, evenings in his study became part of our routine. Sometimes we worked through business paperwork. Other nights we just talked about the early days of Carter Freight, the long drives, the risky decisions, the people who helped him build the company, and slowly, without making a big announcement about it, my grandfather began trusting me with things he once trusted only to Daniel. At the time I didn't fully understand what was happening. I thought I was just helping an aging grandfather. But one evening, as we finished reviewing a stack of delivery contracts, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. "Emily," he said. I looked up from the paperwork. "Yes." He tapped his finger lightly on the desk. "Sometimes the person you expect to carry your legacy isn't the one who actually will." At the time, I thought he was speaking in general terms. Now I know he wasn't. The last year of my grandfather's life changed everything. Though most people sitting in that courtroom would never understand that, they still believed the old version of our family story. The one where Daniel was the natural heir. The one where the Carter Company would eventually pass into his hands like it had always been expected to. But the reality inside my grandfather's house during that final year was very different. His home sat on a quiet stretch of road overlooking Lake Mendota, a place he had lived in for more than 30 years. The house was simple but filled with reminders of the life he built. Old framed photographs of Carter freight trucks lined the hallway. One black and white photo showed the very first truck he ever bought, parked beside the small warehouse where the company began. Another frame held a newspaper clipping from decades earlier announcing the company's expansion into its second state. Those photos were more than decoration. They were his history. Most evenings we sat together in his study, a small room at the back of the house with a wide window facing the lake. From that desk he had managed Carter Freight for decades. Now, during that last year, he rarely visited the warehouse. Instead, the work came to him. Drivers called the house. Managers emailed reports. Invoices and shipping records piled up on his desk. At first, I only helped him organize things. Stacks of paperwork, delivery logs, bills that needed signatures. But slowly the responsibilities changed. One afternoon he slid a folder across the desk toward me. "Take a look at this contract," he said. It was a shipping agreement with a regional supplier. I read through it carefully, unsure what he expected me to notice. "Fuel surcharge doesn't adjust after the first quarter," I said after a moment. "That seems risky." My grandfather nodded slowly. "Exactly." From that day forward, he started asking my opinion on things. Contracts, driver schedules, warehouse repairs. At first I thought he was just keeping my mind busy while we worked. But the more time we spent together, the more it became clear he was teaching me how the company really worked. Sometimes those evenings lasted hours. The house would grow quiet as the sun disappeared behind the lake. The desk lamp cast a soft yellow light across the stacks of papers, while my grandfather explained the decisions that had built Carter Freight over 4 decades. He talked about trust, about drivers who had stayed with the company for 20 years, about contracts he turned down because they didn't feel right. One night, While reviewing an old financial report, he suddenly stopped speaking. He leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Emily," he said. I looked up from the paperwork. "Yes. Do you know the difference between money and legacy?" I laughed softly, thinking he was joking. "I'm guessing there's a lesson coming." He smiled faintly. "Money disappears," he said. "Legacy stays." He gestured around the study, toward the photos on the wall and the folders stacked across his desk. "This company isn't just numbers. It's people. Families. Drivers who depend on those trucks rolling every week." He paused, looking out the window toward the dark lake. "Sometimes the biggest threat to something like that comes from inside the family." At the time, I didn't know exactly what he meant. I thought he was speaking in general terms about business and responsibility. Now I understand he was thinking about Daniel. During that same year, someone else began appearing more often in the house. Margaret Lowell. My grandfather's lawyer had always handled the company's legal work and estate planning. But during those months, her visits became more frequent. She arrived with folders of paperwork and stayed for long meetings in the study. Sometimes they closed the door and spoke privately. Other times my grandfather asked me to sit in with them. That surprised me. One afternoon, Margaret looked at my grandfather with a questioning expression. "Are you certain you want her involved in this?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "She's the only one I trust." Margaret studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. We spent nearly an hour reviewing financial documents and legal language I barely understood. When the meeting ended, Margaret gathered her papers and prepared to leave. But before she stepped out the door, she turned back toward my grandfather. "You're absolutely certain about the wording?" she asked quietly. My grandfather nodded. "It needs to be clear." That conversation stayed in the back of my mind for weeks. But the moment that truly confused me happened a few nights later. I was organizing files in the study when my grandfather asked me to retrieve a folder from the cabinet behind his desk. When I opened the cabinet door, I noticed something I had never seen before. A small wall safe hidden behind several binders. I must have stared at it longer than I realized. Because my grandfather chuckled softly. "That's where the important documents live," he said. "Curious." I stepped aside as he opened the safe. Inside were several envelopes and folders. Old stock certificates, company contracts, legal papers. He removed one sealed envelope and held it in his hand for a moment before placing it back inside. I noticed the words written across the front. "Open if the family fights." I frowned slightly. "Why would you write something like that?" My grandfather closed the safe slowly and spun the dial shut. Then he looked at me with a calm expression I had seen many times before when he was making a serious decision. "Because sometimes people reveal who they really are," he said quietly, "after someone dies." At the time, the comment felt strange. Now, sitting in that courtroom months later, watching my uncle demand half the Carter fortune, I finally understood exactly what my grandfather meant. The morning of my grandfather's funeral was gray and quiet. The kind of cold Wisconsin day when the sky seemed to press down over the lake. The small church near the water had already filled by the time I arrived. Cars lined the gravel parking lot, and people stood in small groups outside the entrance speaking in low voices. Many of them were employees from Carter Freight Logistics. Some had worked with my grandfather for 20 years or more. They weren't there because of inheritance. They were there because of him. Inside the church, the wooden pews creaked softly as people settled into their seats. The pastor stood near the front, speaking quietly with a few relatives while the organ music played in the background. Old photographs of my grandfather had been placed on a table near the altar. One showed him standing beside the first Carter freight truck. Another showed a group of drivers gathered around him outside the warehouse. Looking at those photos, it was easy to remember the man everyone respected. But as I sat in the second row waiting for the service to begin, I noticed something strange. One person was missing. Daniel. My uncle had not visited his father in months. He hadn't been at the house during the final weeks when my grandfather's health began fading. And when the service started, he still hadn't arrived. The pastor began speaking about my grandfather's life. He talked about the early days of Carter Freight, the long hours, The risks my grandfather took to build something that would support families across our town. Employees nodded quietly as they listened. Several of the drivers wiped their eyes. I felt a mixture of sadness and pride hearing those stories again. But halfway through the pastor's speech, the back doors of the church opened. The sound echoed through the quiet room. Everyone turned. Daniel walked in slowly, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses, as if he had just arrived from an important meeting somewhere else. He paused near the entrance for a moment before removing the glasses and scanning the room. A few relatives nodded toward him. Others looked away. He took a seat in the back row. From where I sat, I could see his face clearly. There was no grief there, only calculation. While the pastor continued speaking about my grandfather's generosity and work ethic, Daniel seemed more interested in studying the people inside the church. He watched the relatives. He watched the company employees. And every few minutes, his eyes settled on me. It was the kind of look someone gives when they are already planning their next move. After the service ended, everyone gathered at my grandfather's house for a small reception. The living room filled quickly with relatives and employees sharing memories. Food had been set out on the dining table, and the walls were covered with framed photos from the early days of Carter Freight. Drivers stood together telling stories about long road trips with my grandfather. One man laughed while describing the time my grandfather drove 3 hours in the middle of the night to deliver a replacement engine part to a stranded truck. Listening to them reminded me of the evenings we spent in the study talking about those same stories. But Daniel barely listened. Within 20 minutes of arriving at the house, he had already started asking questions. At first they sounded casual. Has anyone spoken with the lawyer yet? Did Dad update his estate recently? People answered politely, assuming he was just trying to understand what would happen next. But the questions quickly became more specific. Where are the company documents kept? Who has access to the financial accounts now? Eventually, he walked over to where I was standing near the kitchen doorway. Emily, he said with a thin smile. You were living here with him this past year, right? I nodded. Then you probably know where everything is. The way he said it made several people nearby stop talking. It didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like an investigation. Later that afternoon, I overheard him speaking with a few relatives in the living room. I hadn't meant to listen. But his voice carried through the hallway. She lived here the whole year. Daniel said quietly. One of my aunts asked what he meant. He shrugged. You don't think that influenced Dad's decisions? The implication hung in the air. He was suggesting that I had manipulated my grandfather. The room fell quiet. One relative muttered something about waiting for the lawyer before making assumptions. But Daniel only smiled slightly, as if planting the idea was enough. That was the moment I realized my uncle wasn't just curious about the estate. He was preparing a challenge. Near the end of the afternoon, Margaret Lowell arrived briefly. My grandfather's lawyer spoke with several relatives and confirmed that the will would be formally reviewed through probate court. Daniel approached her almost immediately. Have you reviewed the estate distribution yet? He asked. Margaret's expression remained calm. The will speaks for itself, she replied. Daniel smiled confidently. I'm sure it does. As Margaret prepared to leave, she walked past me near the front door. She paused for a moment and lowered her voice. Your grandfather anticipated today. I looked at her, confused. What do you mean? But she simply adjusted her coat and stepped outside. You'll understand at the hearing, she said. That evening the house was quiet again. Most of the relatives had gone home. The kitchen lights were off, and the living room still smelled faintly of coffee and food from the reception. I walked slowly into my grandfather's study. The desk sat exactly as we had left it weeks earlier. The window overlooked the dark lake. For a moment I stood there remembering the nights we spent reviewing company papers together. Then my eyes drifted toward the cabinet behind the desk, the one that hid the small wall safe. Inside that safe was the envelope I had seen months before, the one labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. Open if the family fights. And after hearing my uncle accuse me of influencing my grandfather's decisions, I began to suspect that my grandfather had known exactly what Daniel would do after he died. The tension in the courtroom felt thicker after my uncle's confident declaration that he intended to claim half of my grandfather's estate. The judge sat quietly behind the bench reviewing the documents while the murmurs from the gallery slowly faded. Daniel leaned back in his chair beside his lawyer, completely relaxed, as if the hearing were little more than a formality. From the way he carried himself, anyone watching would have assumed the outcome was already decided. Every few minutes he glanced toward me with a faint smile. Not angry, not nervous, just confident. Beside me, Margaret Lowell sat perfectly still, flipping carefully through the pages of my grandfather's will. Unlike Daniel, she showed no emotion at all. Then she leaned slightly toward me. "This is exactly what your grandfather expected," she whispered. The words made my stomach tighten. For a moment, the courtroom faded from my attention as a memory returned from several weeks earlier. Margaret had asked me to meet her at her law office. At the time, I assumed we would simply review paperwork related to the estate. Her office sat on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse, a quiet place filled with shelves of legal books and framed certificates. When I walked in that afternoon, she closed the door behind me before speaking. "Emily," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "your grandfather left very specific instructions about how his estate should be handled." I sat down across from her desk, trying to understand the seriousness in her voice. "He expected there might be disagreements within the family," she continued. I didn't need to ask who she meant. "Do you think my uncle will challenge the will?" I asked. Margaret paused for a moment before answering. "I would be surprised if he didn't." She reached into a folder on her desk and slid a document toward me. "This is a section of the will your grandfather revised during the last few months of his life." The page was filled with dense legal language. At first it looked like any other legal document. But as I read more closely, I noticed certain phrases repeated throughout the paragraph. Contest of the estate. Beneficiary challenge. Distribution consequences. I looked up at Margaret. "What does this mean?" She folded her hands on the desk. "It means your grandfather anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to claim more than they were given." Her tone remained calm, but there was something else behind it. Preparation. My grandfather had planned for conflict. Margaret pointed gently to a section near the bottom of the page. "This part is important," she said. I leaned closer to read it. The wording was complicated, but the message was clear enough. The will included a protective clause designed to respond if a beneficiary tried to challenge the distribution. "If someone contests the will," Margaret explained carefully, "the situation may change very quickly." I frowned slightly. "What kind of change?" She shook her head. "That part isn't something I should explain yet." "Why not?" "Because the clause only activates under very specific circumstances." I felt a growing uneasiness in my chest. "And if those circumstances happen," Margaret looked at me directly, "then the consequences are permanent." Her voice was calm but firm. "Once it activates, there's no reversing it." The conversation had left me confused. At the time, I didn't fully understand what my grandfather had written into his will. But sitting in the courtroom now, watching Daniel confidently explain why he deserved half the Carter estate, I began to understand. Daniel's lawyer stood and began outlining the argument to the judge. He spoke about my uncle's years working at Carter Freight, about Daniel's role in the company, about the idea that the estate distribution seemed unfair to the eldest son. Several relatives in the gallery nodded slightly. Others remained silent. Margaret continued reviewing the will beside me. She didn't look worried. If anything, she looked patient, like someone waiting for something inevitable. My mind drifted back to something my grandfather had said months earlier in his study. Sometimes people reveal who they really are after someone dies. At the time, I thought he meant grief, family disagreements, old resentments. But now, watching Daniel stand in front of the judge demanding half the estate, I realized my grandfather had meant something much simpler. Greed. Daniel finished speaking and sat down again, looking satisfied with himself. The courtroom murmured quietly. Everyone seemed to believe the argument had changed the direction of the hearing. But beside me, Margaret quietly placed the will on the table between us. She turned to a specific page and tapped lightly on a paragraph highlighted in yellow. "When the time comes," she whispered, "ask the judge to read this section." My eyes moved to the highlighted text. I read the first line carefully, and the moment I understood what the clause actually said, I realized something Daniel clearly had not. By standing in that courtroom and attempting to claim half the Carter fortune, my uncle may have just destroyed his own inheritance. The courtroom had grown noticeably quieter after Daniel's lawyer finished outlining the challenge to my grandfather's will. What had started as a routine probate hearing now felt like something much heavier. Pens scratched against legal pads. Someone shifted in their seat behind me. The low hum of the air conditioning filled the silence between arguments. Daniel leaned back comfortably in his chair beside his attorney. He looked exactly like a man who believed the next few minutes would confirm everything he expected. Every so often his eyes drifted toward me with a small, satisfied smile, as if daring me to respond. His lawyer stood again and adjusted the stack of papers in his hands. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "my client believes the current distribution of the Carter estate deserves further examination." The lawyer spoke about Daniel's years working at Carter Freight Logistics. He mentioned Daniel's experience within the company. He emphasized the idea that the eldest son of Thomas Carter deserved a substantial share of the estate. The words were carefully chosen. Not a direct accusation, but the implication hung clearly in the air. Something about the will didn't feel right. Several relatives sitting behind me whispered quietly to one another. I could feel the weight of their attention shifting in my direction. Daniel finally stood up himself. "My father built that company for his family," he said confidently, addressing the judge directly. "And I was part of that company for years." Then his eyes flicked toward me. "But during the last year of his life," he continued slowly, "certain people were suddenly very close to him." The courtroom fell silent. No one needed him to say more. Everyone understood what he was implying. For a moment I felt dozens of eyes settle on me. Some curious, some uncertain. Daniel wasn't openly accusing me of manipulating my grandfather, but he didn't need to. The suggestion alone was enough. While he spoke, memories surfaced in my mind. The quiet evenings in my grandfather's study, the long hours reviewing contracts and company files, the careful way he explained every decision he had made over the years. My grandfather had not written his final will impulsively. He had planned every detail, slowly, carefully, and he had trusted me enough to let me see parts of that process. Daniel, on the other hand, was presenting a version of the story that sounded convincing to people who hadn't been there, people who didn't know what really happened during that last year. The judge listened patiently while Daniel finished speaking. When the room fell quiet again, he leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Carter," the judge said calmly, "are you presenting evidence that the will is invalid?" Daniel's lawyer stepped in quickly. "We are simply requesting a deeper examination of the distribution," he replied. The judge nodded slowly. "And has anyone here reviewed the full language of the will?" Daniel's lawyer glanced briefly at the document on the table. "Yes, Your Honor. We've reviewed the distribution sections." The judge tilted his head slightly. "But the entire document," the lawyer hesitated. "Our focus has been on the allocation of the estate." Something in the judge's expression shifted. Not suspicion exactly. More like curiosity. Beside me, Margaret Lowell slid the will quietly across the table. She turned to a specific page, the same page she had shown me weeks earlier in her office. Her finger tapped gently against a paragraph halfway down the page. "Now is the time," she whispered. My hands felt strangely steady as I lifted the document. Across the courtroom, Daniel noticed the movement. He frowned slightly. His lawyer leaned toward him and murmured something quietly. But Daniel still looked confident. He clearly believed whatever I was about to say wouldn't matter. The judge looked toward me. "Mid. Carter," he said. "Do you wish to respond to your uncle's claim?" The entire room went still again. Even the faint sound of whispering from the back rows disappeared. I stood slowly from my chair. Daniel watched me with mild irritation. He crossed his arms and leaned back again, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience delaying his victory. but I held the document carefully in both hands. "Your Honor," I said calmly. Before responding to my uncle's claim, "May I ask you to read one specific clause in my grandfather's will?" The judge raised one eyebrow. Daniel's lawyer looked puzzled. Daniel himself sighed softly, clearly assuming this was some minor technical detail. The judge extended his hand. "Of course." I walked forward and placed the document on the bench. The courtroom waited. Daniel leaned toward his lawyer again, whispering something confidently. From his expression, it was obvious he believed the next few moments would change nothing. But as the judge turned to the page Margaret had indicated and began reading silently, something subtle happened. His eyes slowed. His expression shifted slightly. He read the paragraph once. Then he read it again. And in that moment I knew exactly what was about to happen. Because the words in that clause were about to change everything in that courtroom. The courtroom went completely still as the judge turned to the page I had indicated. I stood quietly beside the bench while he adjusted his glasses and began reading the paragraph. At first, his face remained neutral. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair behind me, leaning toward his lawyer and whispering something under his breath. His tone sounded impatient, like a man waiting for a minor delay to end. The judge continued scanning the page. Several seconds passed. Then he stopped. His eyes moved back to the beginning of the paragraph, and he read it again. Slower this time. A faint crease formed between his eyebrows. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel noticed the pause. He sat forward slightly, suddenly paying closer attention. "Your Honor," his lawyer asked carefully. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he finished reading the paragraph in silence before lowering the document slightly. He looked first at Daniel, then at Daniel's lawyer, then back at the will. "I think," the judge said slowly, "this portion should be read into the record." He cleared his throat and began reading aloud. The words filled the quiet courtroom. The clause stated that any beneficiary who attempted to contest or manipulate the distribution of the Carter estate would immediately forfeit their inheritance. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. But the judge continued reading. The clause did not end there. It went on to explain that if such a challenge occurred, the controlling shares of Carter Freight Logistics would automatically transfer to the designated caretaker responsible for Thomas Carter's final year. The judge paused for a moment before finishing the sentence. "That individual," he read clearly, "is Emily Carter?" Silence flooded the courtroom. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. One of the drivers sitting in the back row leaned forward slowly in his seat. Daniel's lawyer reached quickly for the document. "Your Honor, may I see that clause?" The judge handed him the will without speaking. The lawyer read the paragraph quickly, then more carefully the second time. His confident posture from earlier slowly disappeared. Beside him, Daniel frowned. "What does it say?" he asked impatiently. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. He kept reading. Then his shoulders dropped slightly. Daniel snatched the document from him and scanned the page himself. For the first time since the hearing began, his expression changed. The confidence vanished. His eyes moved rapidly across the paragraph. "What is this?" he demanded. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said calmly, "it appears your father anticipated a challenge to the will." Daniel looked up, confusion turning into anger. "That doesn't mean anything," he said quickly. "I'm just asking for a fair distribution." The judge shook his head slightly. "No, Mr. Carter. According to the wording here, formally contesting the will triggers this clause." He tapped the page with one finger. "And you have already done so." The courtroom began whispering again. The judge lifted his hand for silence. Then something unexpected happened. He chuckled. Not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone heard it. He shook his head while glancing at the document again. "I must say," he said, looking toward Daniel, "this is one of the more thorough protective clauses I've seen in a will." A few quiet laughs spread through the room. Daniel stared at him. "You're joking," he said. "I'm not." Daniel turned to his lawyer. "This can't be right." The lawyer avoided his eyes. "The language is very clear," he said quietly. Daniel's face flushed. "You're saying I lose everything because I asked a question." The judge responded calmly. "You didn't ask a question. You contested the distribution of the estate." He pointed again to the clause. "And according to this document, that action forfeits your inheritance." Daniel looked back down at the will, reading the paragraph again as if hoping the words would change. But they didn't. The judge closed the document and placed it back on the bench. "The clause also states," he continued, "that control of Carter Freight Logistics transfers to the designated caretaker of Mr. Carter's final year." His eyes moved toward me. "That would be Ms. Emily Carter." For a moment I could feel every pair of eyes in the courtroom turn toward me again. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier, the room had watched me with suspicion. Now the expressions were very different. Shock, curiosity, and in some cases, quiet approval. Several of the company drivers in the back row nodded to one another. They understood what had just happened. My grandfather had predicted this exact moment. Daniel finally pushed his chair back slightly. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But his voice no longer carried the confidence it had earlier. The judge simply folded his hands. "No. Mr. Carter," he said calmly, "this is exactly what your father intended, and in a single paragraph written months before he died. My grandfather had just taken the entire Carter fortune out of my uncle's hands." For several seconds after the judge finished speaking, no one in the courtroom moved. The air felt strangely heavy, as if the entire room needed time to understand what had just happened. Daniel sat frozen beside his lawyer, still staring at the page of the will as though reading it again might somehow change the words. Behind him, quiet murmurs began spreading through the gallery. A few relatives leaned toward each other in disbelief. One of my grandfather's longtime drivers let out a soft whistle under his breath. The judge calmly organized the papers on his bench, completely unfazed by the tension in the room. Daniel finally turned toward his lawyer. "This can't be right," he said sharply. The lawyer spoke quietly, careful not to attract more attention. "The clause is legally enforceable," he said. "Your father's attorney drafted it clearly." Daniel shook his head. "But I didn't do anything wrong. I just challenged the distribution. That's exactly what the clause addresses." Daniel stared at him for a moment, the reality finally beginning to settle in. By attempting to take half of the Carter estate, he had triggered the one condition that removed him from the inheritance entirely. Across the room, Margaret Lowell remained calm beside me. She had seen this outcome long before today. The judge tapped his pen once against the desk. "For the record," he said, his voice steady, "the court finds the will of Thomas Carter valid and enforceable." The murmurs stopped immediately. He continued. "The clause addressing contest of the estate has been activated by Mr. Daniel Carter's formal challenge." Daniel clenched his jaw. "And according to the language of the will," the judge said, "Mr. Carter forfeits his inheritance under those terms." The room went quiet again. The judge glanced down at the document one last time before adding the final piece. "Control of Carter Freight Logistics transfers as specified within the clause." His eyes lifted toward me. "To Emily Carter." For a moment I didn't react, not because I was surprised, but because the moment carried a weight far greater than money or property. Carter Freight was never just a business. It was my grandfather's life. The judge closed the file and set it aside. "This hearing is concluded." Chairs shifted across the room as people slowly stood. Daniel pushed back from his seat abruptly and walked toward the exit without another word. His lawyer followed quickly behind him. Several relatives stepped aside as he passed. No one tried to stop him. No one tried to comfort him either. The confidence he had walked into the courtroom with was gone completely. Outside in the hallway, the tension dissolved into quiet conversations. A few relatives approached me hesitantly. Some congratulated me. Others simply nodded with uncertain smiles. But the reaction that meant the most came from one of the older drivers from Carter Freight. He was a tall man named Bill who had worked with my grandfather since the company owned only 3 trucks. He stepped toward me slowly. "Your grandfather always knew what he was doing," he said. I smiled slightly. "Yes. I said quietly. He did. Margaret joined me near the courthouse doors. You handled that well, she said. I didn't do anything, I replied. You did exactly what your grandfather trusted you to do. We stepped outside into the cold Wisconsin air. For a moment, we both looked back at the courthouse. I still don't think he wrote that clause just to punish Daniel, I said. Margaret shook her head. No, she said. He wrote it to protect the company. She explained that my grandfather had worried someone might eventually try to seize control of Carter Freight through legal pressure or inheritance disputes. The clause ensured that anyone who attempted to force their way into control would lose that chance entirely. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. That evening, I returned to my grandfather's house. The house was quiet again, just as it had been during the last year we spent together. I walked slowly into his study. The same desk sat by the window overlooking the lake. Stacks of old company files were still arranged neatly on the shelves. For a moment, I stood there imagining him sitting behind the desk again, explaining contracts and delivery routes the way he used to. Patient. Careful. Always thinking 3 steps ahead. Then I sat down in the chair across from the desk. And I realized something important. My grandfather hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a responsibility. Carter Freight wasn't about trucks or contracts. It was about the drivers who depended on those routes, the employees who had trusted my grandfather for decades, the reputation he built slowly, decision by decision. And now that responsibility belonged to me. As strange as it sounds, the moment I remember most clearly from that entire day wasn't when the judge announced the ruling. It was the moment just before that, when the judge read the clause and quietly started laughing. Because in that moment, everyone in the courtroom realized the same thing. My grandfather had predicted exactly what would happen, and he had already written the ending to the story. Sometimes the clearest message someone leaves behind isn't spoken. Sometimes it's written in a single paragraph no one bothers to read carefully. And sometimes karma doesn't arrive through anger or revenge. Sometimes it simply arrives through patience and planning. Now I'm curious what you would have thought if you were sitting in that courtroom that day. Do you think my uncle deserved to lose everything after trying to take half of the estate? Or do you think my grandfather went too far by writing that clause into his will? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy real family stories like this, stories about inheritance, betrayal, and the unexpected ways justice finds its way into people's lives, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't shouting or fighting. Sometimes it's simply letting the truth reveal itself.